So if you've been to the conference website and read the paper in advance, you have discovered a slight revision now of the title, as is natural when you write the abstract halfway through the analysis process on a project. So the title of the paper is now Between Ritual and Advertisement. In January 2021, the Lutheran Diocese of Stockholm and University College of Stockholm launched an action research project called Church in Digital Space, with the aim to map and develop the experiences and skills gained from the digital transition during the pandemic and find out how to keep the online church gates open in a sustainable and theologically informed way, even after the pandemic. And among the unusually large number of congregations that applied for participation, 7 were chosen. 5 researchers were engaged, led by Professor in Practical Theology Jonas Ideström and the Bishop's Theological Advisor Sara Garpe. The goals of the Action Research Project were to understand and develop the online presence in the congregations, for example, increased interaction, participation, and community, and also to create a deepened understanding of theology and communication when Christian faith and community is expressed and manifested in digital spaces, and also to create knowledge source for other congregations in the Church of Sweden. And as part of the overarching project, there were several smaller, more pointed projects that leaned into what the practitioners wanted to research and develop in their respective congregations. And the report of the project as a whole will be released in September. And this paper concerns one of those smaller pointed projects, number 2. The researchers, Bible scholar Dr. Rickard Reuto and myself, teamed up with the practitioners in Järfälla and Täby congregations who wish to research and develop their pre-recorded digital mediated worship services. And together we decided to focus on 3 concepts: interaction, synchronicity, and integrity. The word interaction was chosen in relation to, well, one of the purposes of the project as a whole. The concept synchronicity was chosen since this feature often facilitates interaction. And during the spring of 2021, there was a large debate in one of the church-oriented newspapers in Sweden, discussing to what extent asynchronous pre-recorded worship services can offer interaction and community at all. So of course, the practitioners were very eager to know more about this in relation to their pre-recorded online worships. And the concept integrity was suggested by us researchers due to the fact that the context was a Lutheran folk church in thoroughly secularized Sweden, with a very high percentage of members in the category that Grace Davies once called belonging but not believing. In other words, they are members, but they do not participate in any worship services or other activities. They are members, but they do not come to the church building. But during the first iteration, it turned out that the integrity that the practitioners in the congregation wanted to talk about was their own integrity. So therefore, both aspects were included and explored. A bit about the design of the project. Researchers and practitioners in each congregation met once a month from August 2021 to February this year. So the researchers observed as the practitioners prepared and recorded their worship services, and also how it was published and received. We also interviewed all the practitioners involved, and a month later, researchers and practitioners met for conversations. So the researchers presented an analysis of what we had seen and heard, theories that could aid the understanding of what was going on, and then facilitated a discussion in which the practitioners could respond to the analysis and reflect on their practices. And there were 6 such iterations in each congregation. And there were also several theories introduced in these conversations. Among them, well, you see examples here: ritual theory, Professor Campbell's concept of religious digital creatives, and also Professor in Communication, John Durham Peters' concepts, dialogue and dissemination. So at the starting point of the project in August 2021, the congregations were quite similar and shared many traits. They shared their what and how and why. So during the church lockdown, they had all decided to make shorter, like 10 minutes long pre-recorded worship services to accommodate the regulars. Both congregations worked in similar ways. They recorded on Tuesdays, edited during the week, and then published at the end of the week at an appointed time on the church website, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, the institution's accounts. They also had about the same amount of viewers every week, about 100 on each platform, but on occasion more. They also shared the context, both situated in the capital of Sweden, urban area, under the same legislation, pandemic restrictions, also quite similar in size, with 4 or 5 brick and mortar churches and around 30,000 members. And also very similar in their access to resources. So they had employees with technical know-how, also able to invest in good technical equipment. So they were quite similar. And all this kind of functioned as a frame in which interaction and synchronicity and integrity were negotiated. And they also shared, finally, a sense of lack of theological understanding of what they were doing. Nevertheless, just because theology is not explicit, it does not mean it's not there. Theology, especially ecclesiology, is implicit in all church practices. And furthermore, as Professor Campbell has shown, theology is usually a key feature when religious communities negotiate their use of new media. So as the practitioners began to uncover and articulate their theological reasoning, it became evident that theology had not been lacking in their way to work with technology. In fact, it seemed to unconsciously have guided their choices from the beginning. It was like the water that the fish can't see because they are swimming in it. And furthermore, when they became more aware and outspoken about their theological and ecclesiological understanding, they began to make adjustments to their online services accordingly. So over time, these two seemingly similar congregations differed more and more in their approach to the digital mediated worship services and how they thought of interaction, synchronicity, and integrity. And in February 2022, they had negotiated 2 quite different versions of what this new normal or hybrid church should be. So at the end of the project, the researcher proposed to the practitioners that this difference could be described as emphasizing opposite poles in the dynamic tension between the ritual and something that the practitioners repeatedly called advertisement. The word advertisement occurred frequently in the source material. However, in the conversations with the practitioners themselves, it became evident that they did not mean advertisement as marketing a product, but as a way to understand church and the mission of the church. This tension between ritual and advertisement were interpreted and contextualized by the work of Professor Ideström in the overarching project. When he compared the operant ecclesiology in all these 7 congregations, he found recurring patterns in how the church and its mission was conceived. So he proposed 3 models as a way to show and understand how the theological presumptions about church affects and emerges in and through digital space in these 7 congregations. I invite you to read more about the models in the paper, since time is limited here. In practice, of course, these models were not as clear-cut as Ideström describes them, but the congregations are a mix of several of the models. But during the course of the project, they shifted to emphasize one of the models more clearly, at least in relation to their online services. So the practitioners in Täby emphasized the ritual part of the spectrum, and church or folk church, this is Swedish Lutheran Church, as sacramentally enacted, that the gospel needs to be communicated in a particular form. Since medium is the message, it needs to stick to the traditional forms. For example, the liturgy as it looks in the brick and mortar church. And they began to conceive of their online church as their 7th church and describe the digital mediated worship services as inviting folk or people into that space to participate in the worship with them. The practitioners in Järfälla, on the other hand, emphasized the advertisement part of the spectrum and church as an address of the gospel in everyday life. They had the idea that the gospel is effective in people's everyday life. That is the most important part of the church. And it's not as important that people who are affected by the gospel come to the brick and mortar church and show their faces. It's good enough that they live out their calling in their everyday life. And they described it as people being invited into, or rather as the practitioners being invited into people's own space of their everyday life with the message of the gospel. So church as inviting and church as inviting. And these two, emphasis on the ecclesiological model and also position in this ritual advertisement spectrum, affected very much how they understood and then negotiated interaction, synchronicity, and integrity. And I will give a few examples of that. When it comes to interaction, there was a difference in the expectation of what kind of interaction that would take place and was important. The practitioners in Täby who emphasized ritual compared their online services to how participants in a local worship would interact. So their main concern was how to include interactive elements into the order of the worship service. But the practitioners in Järfälla who emphasized advertisement compared it how to participants in a local worship would interact with the sermon or respond to a sermon. So their main concern was about interaction in relation to the published worship service, like likes and comments and so on, that kind of responses. However, both congregations mentioned both kinds of interaction, of course, and in both cases, the practitioners observed that interaction was low. So they proposed that the explanation was a combination of their choice of platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. There are platforms that function as public forums, and the practitioners also use the institution's accounts who wants to interact with an institution. And they also thought it was because of the nature of the members of the Church of Sweden who were cautious because of integrity reasons to be visible and to interact. And in addition, this low interaction also caused both congregations to express a feeling that we researchers came to call interaction shame. During the course of the project, however, the interaction shame was a bit reduced. And one important reason for that was Jordan Peter's theory of dialogue and dissemination that provided theological reasoning for broadcasting church and also kind of enhanced the idea that the meaning-making process and decision to participate is up to the receiver. That some things happen at the receiving end and we cannot control it on the sending end. So towards the end of the project, the practitioners also mentioned that the reduced interaction shame was due to a shift in motivation. Views, comments, and other interactions were to them proof that their work was important and meaningful, served as motivation in relation to their co-workers' doubts about online worship. But when they had articulated theological motives for their work, it was not as important anymore to count interactions. So I were to paraphrase Heidi Campbell's work on digital creatives and the rethinking of religious authority. She talks about the tension between algorithmic authority based on visibility and numbers, and traditional authority. So what we see here has been a shift from algorithmic motivation to traditional theological motivation for what they were doing. Saying something short about synchronicity, for ritually oriented Täby, synchronicity caused a huge problem. To compensate for this, they had used a number of strategies. One was to record the service as a whole without interruptions in order to create at least some kind of sense of synchronicity at the people participating, recording it, that they thought could transfer to the receivers later on. Another strategy was to publish at a certain time to enable for participants to at least participate at the same time. For the advertisement-oriented Järfälla, synchronicity was not such a pressing problem. However, they also published at a certain time to enable for synchronous participation. And in accordance with their church as an address into everyday life approach, the important thing to them was to adjust the form of the address to facilitate for a feeling of here and now synchronicity. An example of how their different theological positions in relation to synchronicity played out is found in their reasoning about the blessing. To the pastor in Täby, the blessing was understood as a ritual element that is performed in real time, and to her that raised questions whether or not a pre-recorded blessing could be effective or not. But to the pastor in Järfälla, the blessing was understood as an address that could be effective whenever someone listened to it. So to her, the important thing was how to phrase the blessing in a way that encouraged people to really listen to it. Both congregations also pointed to advantages with asynchronicity. So the most important advantage for not having asynchronous worship was that it was considered beneficial for integrity. The participants or the viewers' integrity was considered the trump card of the pre-recorded worship service. According to the practitioners, it provided a perfect opportunity for the large belonging but not yet believing category to participate without being seen. This was described as especially important in their urban context, where there are a lot of social pressure to conform to trends and keep up appearance, and people may not dare to come to church even if they want to. So because of this, the practitioners thought it was just as important with digital mediated worship services in the big city as it is in the rural areas, where people can't come to church because of large distances. And as earlier mentioned, the integrity that the practitioners preferred to talk about was their own. In fact, integrity was almost always intertwined with the two other concepts in the practitioners' reasoning. When they spoke of interaction and synchronicity, they almost always also talked about their own integrity too. And integrity was often also part of the reason why they choose a certain strategy or why they choose to do something with interaction or synchronicity. The practitioners in both congregations found it difficult with integrity in the recording phase when they had to stand in front of the camera. There were various reasons for this. They experienced it as a loss of control, that they did not know who was watching or how they were interpreted. They worried about critique from their own inner perfectionists and other people, colleagues, acquaintances, heresy hunters, and they were uncomfortable with blending private and professional. And both congregations employed strategies to handle this. For example, the technicians were very important as instructors and someone who could be trusted not to let anything pass. Another strategy was to include something visual in order to direct the participants' attention to something else than me. And also the asynchronicity of pre-recording was explicitly mentioned as a key strategy to cope with the worry or the sense of lost integrity. And also the low interaction could be seen in light of this, not as a strategy, but as a cause frequently mentioned for low interaction. For example, in both congregations, the practitioners were aware that publication on the institutional platform caused low interaction. They all knew, and their communication directors kept reminding everyone, if you share the worship services as persons in your own social media accounts, there will be so much more interaction and views. And yet they did not. There were various reasons for this, but the two most important had to do with integrity. Either they did not share anything in social media for integrity reasons and not services either, or they wanted to separate their personal and professional, private and professional identity. So that was a few examples of how theology affected the development of the online services and also the negotiation in relation to these three concepts. I am out of time, so I might just read more.
So if you could move to your conclusion.
Yes,
great.
I just wanted to say, please read the paper and thank you.